The summer of 2015 in Texas had turned out to be exceptionally brutal, the kind of heat that seemed to press down on everything like a heavy, unrelenting hand. Huntsville Prison, a sprawling fortress of red brick surrounded by loops of razor-sharp barbed wire, shimmered under the relentless sun, its walls absorbing the blistering rays until the air itself felt thick and oppressive. Inside, on the second floor of the administration building, Warden Laverne Winfrey sat in her office, a space that reflected her unyielding nature. She was a woman forged by 2 decades in the correctional system, her will as hard as iron, her gaze sharp enough to cut through the toughest facade. Her desk, though cluttered with neatly stacked folders, bore the mark of meticulous organization, each file aligned with precision, each pen resting in its proper place. A small, rattling desk fan hummed incessantly, stirring the stagnant, hot air in a futile attempt to offer relief. Laverne had spent 20 years climbing the ranks of the prison system, earning a reputation as a warden who knew every shadowed corner of Huntsville, every written regulation, and every unwritten code that governed the lives within its walls. Her authority was absolute, her control unwavering. That morning, the prison had buzzed with its usual rhythm, but a new arrival had shifted the routine just enough to draw her attention. A transfer was scheduled from another facility, bringing a single inmate into Huntsville's fold. His name was Desmond Lewis, a 32-year-old man convicted of armed bank robbery, sentenced to 12 years behind bars. His file had sat on her desk for a week, its pages worn at the edges from her occasional perusal, a former mechanic, disciplined, no infractions noted from his prior institution. Laverne had skimmed the details with her usual detachment, committing the essentials to memory, 12 years, clean record, skilled with machines. She rose from her chair, smoothing the crisp lines of her uniform, and made her way down to the intake area. Her boots echoed against the concrete floor, a steady, deliberate cadence that announced her presence long before she appeared. The guards straightened as she passed, their movements sharp with deference. Desmond Lewis arrived in a rattling transport van, its engine coughing as it rolled through the prison gates. When he stepped out, flanked by 2 officers, Laverne took him in with a quick, assessing glance. He was solid, broad-shouldered, and sturdy, his frame suggesting strength earned through labor rather than bravado. His hands, bound in cuffs, hung loosely at his sides, but there was no slouch in his posture, no hint of defeat. His eyes met hers briefly, calm and steady, carrying a quiet pride that didn't bend under the weight of his circumstances. She delivered the rules in her clipped, frigid tone, the same speech she'd given countless times before. He'd be assigned to the maintenance workshop, tasked with repairing equipment. Any misstep would land him in solitary. Desmond stood motionless as she spoke, his expression unreadable, absorbing her words without reaction. The intake process unfolded smoothly, paperwork signed, belongings searched, cuffs removed, and soon he was escorted to his cell block, disappearing into the labyrinth of Huntsville's corridors. The day wore on in its predictable pattern. Laverne moved through her duties with mechanical efficiency, inspecting cell blocks, reviewing incident reports, signing off on supply requisitions. The heat pressed against the prison's thick walls, seeping into every room, making the air heavy with the scent of sweat and metal. Guards grumbled under their breath, inmates shuffled listlessly, but Laverne remained unfazed, her focus unbroken. Yet, as the hours ticked by, something lingered in the back of her mind, a faint, nagging sensation she couldn't quite place. It wasn't Desmond's file or his crime that stuck with her, it was the way he carried himself, the subtle dignity in his stance, the silence that felt deliberate rather than submissive. She brushed it aside, chalking it up to fatigue or the oppressive heat playing tricks on her senses. As evening approached, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the prison yard. Laverne made her final rounds, her boots clicking against the floor as she passed the maintenance workshop. Through the grimy window, she caught sight of Desmond at work. He knelt beside an old generator, its rusted casing pried open, tools scattered around him in a semicircle. His hands moved with practiced ease, dismantling the engine piece by piece, his focus absolute. The dim light of a hanging bulb caught the sweat glistening on his brow, but he didn't pause, didn't falter. There was a certainty in his motions, a mastery that spoke of years spent coaxing life from broken machines. Laverne lingered for a moment, watching him, then turned away, her jaw tightening as she forced the odd flicker of curiosity from her mind. The prison settled into its nightly hush, the clanging of cell doors signaling lights out. Laverne returned to her office, the fan still whirring, the air still thick. She sank into her chair, her fingers brushing the edge of Desmond's file before pushing it aside. Outside, the cicadas droned in the darkness, their chorus blending with the distant hum of the prison's generators. She leaned back, staring at the ceiling, unaware that this sweltering day in July had planted the first seed of something that would grow beyond her control. For now, it was just another day in Huntsville, another inmate, another file, another cog in the machine she ran with unrelenting precision. The heat pressed on, the night stretched out, and Laverne Winfrey remained oblivious to the shift that had already begun. A month had passed since Desmond Lewis's arrival, and in that time, he had carved out a quiet niche for himself within the gritty confines of Huntsville Prison. The maintenance workshop, a cavernous room tucked away near the back of the facility, had become his domain. Its concrete floor was stained with years of oil and grime, its walls lined with shelves sagging under the weight of tools and spare parts. The air carried the sharp tang of metal and the faint mustiness of old machinery, but Desmond moved through it with a purpose that seemed to breathe life into the space. He had a knack for fixing things, old fans with rattling blades, fluorescent lamps that flickered and died, even a rusted-out lawnmower that hadn't run in years. Under his hands, these relics sputtered back to life, their mechanical hums a testament to his skill. The other inmates took notice, their sidelong glances shifting from suspicion to grudging respect. He didn't swagger or pick fights, didn't posture like so many others in the prison's tense pecking order, but when he spoke, quietly, firmly, his words carried weight, and the men listened. Laverne Winfrey had started making more frequent visits to the workshop, her presence cloaked in the guise of routine inspections. She'd stride in with her clipboard, her boots clicking against the floor, her eyes sweeping over the cluttered benches and the half-dismantled machines. But more often than not, her gaze lingered on Desmond. She watched the way he worked, his movements precise and deliberate, almost surgical in their accuracy. He'd hunch over a motor, his fingers deftly twisting wires or tightening bolts, his brow furrowed in concentration. There was something mesmerizing in it, a rhythm she couldn't quite ignore. She told herself it was her job to monitor him, to ensure he wasn't slacking or smuggling contraband, but the truth gnawed at her, a curiosity she hadn't felt in years was stirring, faint but persistent. One evening in mid-August, the heat had finally begun to ease, the sun dipping low enough to let a sluggish breeze drift through the open workshop door. Laverne had finished her rounds early and found herself lingering in the workshop longer than intended. Desmond was there, as always, bent over an ancient radio that had been gathering dust in a corner. Its casing was cracked, its wires a tangled mess, but he was methodically stripping them down, testing each connection with a small voltmeter. She stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching him work. He didn't look up, but after a moment, he began to talk, casually, almost to himself, about how he used to scavenge parts from junkyards as a teenager, piecing together motorcycles from scraps. Laverne, who had grown up in a household where busted engines were as common as dinner plates, found herself drawn in. She knew the smell of gasoline and the feel of a wrench in her hand, memories from a life before the prison system had claimed her. Without meaning to, she responded, mentioning a trick her father had taught her for loosening stubborn bolts. The exchange stretched on, unhurried, a rare crack in the armor of her usual reserve. From that night, their conversations became a quiet ritual. They'd talk about engines, carburetors and pistons, the quirks of vintage Fords versus Chevys, or the heavy old American trucks that used to rumble down Texas highways. Desmond had a way of recounting things, his voice low and steady, that pulled her in despite herself. She noticed how these moments softened the edges of her days, offering a strange reprieve from the endless grind of reports, disciplinary hearings, and the constant hum of tension that defined Huntsville. Her assistant, Keisha Thompson, a sharp-eyed young guard with a knack for reading people, picked up on the change. She'd see Laverne heading toward the workshop more often, her stride less rigid, her face less stern. Keisha kept her observations to herself, But she couldn't miss the subtle shift. Laverne was thawing, just a little, in a way she hadn't in the 3 years Keisha had worked under her. One afternoon, as the sun beat down relentlessly outside, Desmond was tinkering with a seized-up air conditioner unit. Laverne stood nearby, ostensibly checking a maintenance log, when he reached across the workbench to hand her a screwdriver she hadn't asked for. Their hands brushed, his warm and calloused, hers cool and tense, and the contact jolted her. She yanked her hand back as if stung, the tool clattering onto the bench. Desmond paused, his eyes flicking up to meet hers for a split second, but he said nothing, returning to his work as if the moment hadn't happened. Laverne turned away, her pulse thudding in her ears, and busied herself with the logbook, her fingers gripping the pen too tightly. That night, 5 miles away in her small, sparsely furnished apartment, she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. The hum of her own air conditioner filled the silence, but her mind wouldn't settle. She traced back through the years, decades of discipline, of burying anything that didn't serve the job, and wondered when she'd last let herself drift from that path. The heat outside hadn't relented, pressing against the windows, but inside the workshop, something new was taking root, fragile and unspoken, its shape still too faint to grasp. By September, the bond between Laverne Winfrey and Desmond Lewis had deepened into something undeniable, a current that pulled them beyond the safe boundaries of their earlier exchanges. What had started as casual talks in the workshop had evolved into clandestine meetings, moments stolen in the shadows of Huntsville prison's rigid structure. They found each other after lights out in the maintenance workshop, its heavy doors muffling the sounds of the prison's nighttime hum, or in the cluttered parts storage room, where shelves of dusty gears and bolts shielded them from prying eyes. On rare nights when Laverne pulled overnight shifts, her office became their refuge, the locked door and drawn blinds a fragile barrier against the world outside. During the day, she remained the unyielding warden, barking orders at staff meetings, reprimanding guards for sloppy patrols, her presence a force that kept the prison's chaos in check. But when darkness fell, she shed that armor, giving in to emotions she hadn't known she could still feel, a vulnerability she'd buried long ago beneath years of discipline and control. The thrill of being caught, the constant edge of danger, only fueled the fire between them, making each encounter more reckless, more urgent. Keisha Thompson stumbled upon their secret one humid evening in late September. She'd been doing a routine sweep of the workshop, her flashlight cutting through the dimness, when she spotted them. Laverne stood closer to Desmond than protocol allowed, her shoulder brushing his as he bent over a flickering desk lamp, tweaking its wiring. Their eyes locked for a moment, a glance that carried more weight than words, heavy with something unspoken. Keisha froze, her breath catching, then slipped back into the hallway without a sound, the beam of her light trembling slightly. She said nothing, her loyalty to Laverne outweighing any instinct to report it. 3 years earlier, Laverne had fought to keep Keisha on staff after a botched incident with an inmate had nearly cost her the job, and that debt ran deep. From then on, Keisha turned a blind eye, her silence a shield for the woman who'd saved her career. In those stolen moments, Desmond opened up to Laverne, peeling back layers of his past like pages from a worn book. He spoke of a small town near the Texas-Mexico border, a dusty speck on the map where he'd grown up tinkering with cars in a gravel-strewn yard. He dreamed of owning his own auto shop, a place where he could build something lasting, but a single, desperate choice, robbing a bank to pay off a debt, had derailed that vision, landing him in cuffs. His voice softened when he told her he harbored no regrets, that the winding path of his mistakes had brought him to her. Laverne listened, her guard slipping with each story, and for the first time in decades, she felt less like the warden and more like a woman, alive, unguarded, tethered to someone in a way she hadn't thought possible. Her mind began to drift toward a future, hazy and improbable, where Desmond's 10 remaining years behind bars might somehow end with them together, free from the prison's iron grip. But as October dawned, a shadow crept into their connection. Desmond grew quieter, his hands still deft with tools, but his demeanor heavier, as if something weighed on him. One night in the workshop, as he tightened the last screw on a repaired generator, he hesitated, his mouth opening briefly like he meant to confess something. Before he could, the clatter of boots echoed down the corridor, guards making their rounds, and he clamped shut, the moment lost. Laverne barely registered it, too caught in the pull of their closeness, but the next day brought a reckoning she couldn't ignore. She'd gone for a routine medical checkup, a formality she'd endured countless times, and sat in her office as the prison doctor delivered the results. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have, and when she tore it open, the words on the page hit her like a punch. Hepatitis C. Silence swallowed the room, her breath shallow as her mind raced to Desmond, to their nights together, to the intimacy she'd let consume her. The realization clawed at her. Somewhere along the way, he'd passed this to her, and the fragile world she'd built around him cracked, then shattered entirely. That night, Laverne Winfrey marched to the workshop with a heaviness in her stride, each step resounding like the strike of a hammer against steel. The prison was quiet, its corridors dim and still after lights out, but her mind roared with the betrayal she'd uncovered. Desmond Lewis was there, hunched over an old fan, its blade stripped bare as he worked on its motor with the same steady hands she'd once admired. The hum of his tools filled the air, a faint counterpoint to the silence beyond the workshop's walls, but when he looked up and saw her face, pale, taut with fury, he stopped cold, his wrench slipping from his grip to clatter against the workbench. She didn't hesitate, her eyes boring into him as she demanded the truth. Desmond's shoulders sagged, and after a moment, he admitted it. He'd known about the hepatitis C for 2 years, diagnosed in another prison long before he'd ever set foot in Huntsville. He'd kept it hidden, he confessed, terrified that revealing it would drive her away. Laverne stood motionless, her chest tightening as his words sank in, anger surging through her like wildfire, tangled with a raw, piercing hurt. She'd trusted him, let him past every defense she'd built, and he'd concealed a danger that now coursed through her veins. He tried to explain, his hands reaching out as if to bridge the gap, insisting his feelings had been real, but she cut him off, her voice quaking with rage, each syllable a lash. She turned and stormed out, leaving him in the shadowed workshop, the fan's dismantled pieces scattered like the ruins of what they'd had. The next morning, Laverne sat at her desk, the dawn light filtering through the blinds in thin, dusty slats. Her hand didn't tremble as she signed the transfer order, her pen slicing across the page with a sharpness that mirrored the edge in her heart. Desmond Lewis was to be moved to the maximum security block, effective immediately, no discussion, no appeal. The document was crisp, official, a cold severing of their ties. By midday, he was gone from the workshop, escorted by 2 guards through Huntsville's maze of hallways to his new reality. The Max block was a different beast, its cells narrower, its air thicker with the stench of unwashed bodies and despair. The walls were scarred with scratches, the bars rusted but unyielding. Guards there smirked as they shoved him into his new cell, their taunts low and cruel, while the other inmates sized him up through narrowed eyes. Word of his affair with the warden had spread like a plague, seeping through the prison's grapevine faster than wildfire. It made him a target, a marked man in a place where weakness was blood in the water. Desmond sat on the thin mattress of his bunk, the springs creaking under his weight, and felt the hostility closing in. That night, alone in the dark, he pulled a scrap of paper from beneath his pillow and began to write. Over 3 pages, in tight, careful script, he poured out his soul, his guilt for what he'd done, his fear of the emptiness ahead, the love he still carried for her despite everything. He folded the letter and slipped it to a young guard during the next shift change, trading it for a pack of cigarettes he'd hoarded, though he knew deep down Laverne would never see it. Back in her office, Laverne gazed out the window at the empty prison yard, where a lone floodlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the cracked asphalt. The silence pressed against her, heavy and cold. In the drawer of her desk lay her service revolver, its weight familiar but untouched for now. She didn't reach for it. Instead, her mind sharpened, turning over the pieces of a plan, something slow, deliberate, a revenge that would wield the prison itself as her weapon. The heat of her anger had cooled into something harder, more precise, and she sat there, plotting, as the night stretched on. Meanwhile, in his cell, Desmond felt the walls closing in, the air thick with the certainty that his time was running out. He didn't fight it, didn't plead or bargain. The spark of hope that had once flickered inside him dimmed, then faded entirely, leaving only a hollow resignation in its wake. The morning of November 15, 2015, dawned with a rarity in Texas, a steady, gray drizzle that streaked the prison's red brick walls and left the yard slick with shallow puddles. Laverne Winfrey arrived at Huntsville earlier than usual, her boots leaving faint damp prints on the concrete as she strode through the administration building. Her face remained a mask of calm, betraying nothing, though her fingers betrayed a slight tremor as she sat at her desk, signing the day's paperwork with mechanical precision. The soft patter of rain against the window filled the silence, a muted backdrop to the storm brewing within her. Meanwhile, Desmond Lewis stirred in his cell in the maximum security block, his head throbbing with a dull ache that had plagued him since dawn. He requested a trip to the infirmary, citing the headache, and a guard grudgingly obliged, leading him down the corridor with a lazy shuffle. But as they passed the familiar turn toward the workshop, Desmond veered off, his steps deliberate, the guard lagging a few paces behind, distracted by the jingle of his keys. Inside the workshop, the air hung heavy with the scent of oil and metal, unchanged despite the weeks since Desmond had last worked there. He stood alone among the tools, his hand trailing along the edge of the workbench, fingers brushing the worn wood as if tracing memories etched into its grain. The shelves loomed around him, laden with wrenches, screwdrivers, and spare parts, all silent witnesses to the hours he'd spent coaxing life from broken machines. His gaze lingered on the spot where he'd once repaired a generator under Laverne's watchful eye, a moment now distant, like a scene from someone else's life. He moved slowly, almost reverently, as if bidding farewell to the only place in Huntsville that had ever felt like his own. At the same time, a group of inmates slipped through the prison's labyrinthine halls, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Leading them was Baxter Reed, a hulking figure with a reputation as a brutal enforcer, his presence alone enough to quiet a room. His shaved head gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights, and his stride carried the confidence of a man who ruled through fear. The others followed close behind, their faces set, hands tucked into sleeves, eyes darting to the shadows. Keisha Thompson spotted them from her post near the administration wing, her pen pausing over the duty log as she caught their silhouettes moving down the corridor. She recognized Baxter's bulk instantly, knew the kind of trouble that trailed him, but she turned her head, burying her focus in the pages before her, the scratch of her pen drowning out the thud of their boots. At 2:30 p.m., a muffled thud echoed from the workshop, a single, heavy sound that cut through the stillness, then dissolved into an eerie quiet. The rain outside drummed on, oblivious. Minutes later, a young guard, making his rounds, pushed open the workshop door and froze. Desmond lay sprawled across the floor, his body crumpled amid a scatter of tools, wrenches, and pliers flung wide, as if knocked loose in a struggle. Blood pooled beneath him, dark and viscous, seeping from where a screwdriver had been driven deep into his chest, its handle jutting out like a grim marker. His face was a mess of red, bruised and swollen, the features that had once held quiet pride now unrecognizable. In his right hand, clenched tight even in death, was an old engine repair manual, tattered, its pages stained with grease, a relic of the work that had defined him here. Laverne sat in her office, hands folded neatly on her desk, her breathing steady and measured, as if the morning's events were just another routine shift. The rain tapped a soft rhythm against the glass, and she stared past it, her eyes fixed on nothing. When the detectives arrived, two figures in damp coats, their badges glinting under the office lights, she met their questions with a voice flat and emotionless, her answers clipped, precise, offering nothing beyond the bare facts. She sat rigid, a statue of control, while across the prison, Baxter Reed and his crew slipped back into their block. Their clothes bore no stains, their hands clean, but the smirks curling their lips told a story their silence wouldn't. The deed was done, the prison's undercurrent of rage turned against Desmond at Laverne's unseen command, her vengeance delivered through others, her own hands untouched by the blood now drying on the workshop floor. The investigation stretched across 3 grueling weeks, a slow unraveling of the events that had left Desmond Lewis dead on the workshop floor. Detectives Lonnie Preston and Aaron Cox took the lead, a mismatched pair navigating the case with dogged persistence. Lonnie, a grizzled veteran with salt and pepper hair and a smoker's rasp, had spent decades untangling prison crimes, while Aaron, a sharp-minded rookie with auburn curls and a notepad always in hand, brought fresh eyes to the evidence. They pored over grainy security footage, sifted through witness statements, and studied the blood patterns that had dried into the concrete, each clue a thread in a tapestry they couldn't quite weave together. Suspicion settled heavily on Laverne Winfrey. The motive glared at them like a neon sign: betrayal, sickness, a wound too deep to heal, but the proof remained elusive, slipping through their fingers like sand. The cameras flanking the corridor to the workshop had gone dark for exactly 20 minutes, a glitch too convenient to ignore, and the guard schedules had shifted in the days prior, seasoned officers replaced by green recruits. Yet every anomaly pointed to coincidence, not conspiracy, and the detectives found themselves chasing shadows. Baxter Reed faced the consequences, his hulking frame slouched in an interrogation room as Lonnie and Aaron pressed him for answers. He offered nothing, his lips sealed tight, his eyes glinting with a defiance that dared them to push harder. The evidence tied him to the killing: blood on a discarded rag, a partial print on a wrench, but he took the fall alone, his crew closing ranks behind him. A judge added years to his sentence, a hollow victory that left the deeper truth buried. The others involved, faceless figures in the prison's underbelly, stayed silent, their loyalty to Baxter, or perhaps their fear, outweighing any deal the detectives could offer. With no smoking gun, no confession, no direct link to Laverne, the case crumbled. The district attorney reviewed the file, shook his head, and declared it unprovable, closing it with a thud that echoed through the precinct. Laverne emerged unscathed, her hands clean in the eyes of the law. She returned to her duties at Huntsville with the same iron grip that had defined her tenure. She conducted inspections, her boots clicking through the cell blocks, her gaze slicing through the inmates' bravado. She signed orders with a steady hand, her desk as orderly as ever, the fan still rattling in the corner. The prison bed to her will, its rhythm unbroken, but time began to mark her, strands of gray threaded through her dark hair, a subtle sign of the years piling on. Her posture, though, never wavered, her spine straight as a rod, a testament to the discipline that had carried her through 2 decades. The workshop saw changes too. A new inmate took Desmond's place, a wiry man with quick hands who patched up generators and lamps with quiet efficiency. The old engine repair manual, its pages creased and oil-stained, was boxed up and shipped to the evidence archive, a mute relic of the man who'd once held it. Keisha Thompson watched Laverne from a distance, the only soul in Huntsville who knew the full weight of what had transpired. She saw the shift in her boss, subtle but profound, a hollowness that settled into Laverne's eyes, a coldness that seemed to seep into her bones. It wasn't regret or guilt, Keisha thought, but an absence, as if something vital had burned away in the fire of her revenge. A year later, in November 2016, Laverne's visits to the workshop grew sporadic. She'd step inside on quiet evenings, her fingers brushing the tools, a wrench here, a screwdriver there, as if searching for the warmth of those lost days. The air smelled the same, oil and metal mingling in a familiar haze, but it offered no comfort, only echoes she couldn't grasp. Desmond Lewis's case file gathered dust in a storage room at the Department of Corrections, its pages yellowing, its questions unanswered. Yet within Huntsville's walls, whispers took root, passing from cell to cell like contraband. The inmates spoke in hushed tones of the warden who'd loved, who'd lost, who'd turned the prison's own brutality into her instrument of retribution. They didn't know the details, not the way Keisha did, but they felt the legend growing, a story of a woman who'd paid for her victory with a piece of herself. The prison churned on, its days bleeding into nights, its routines as relentless as the Texas sun. Laverne remained its queen, ruling her fortress with an authority that brooked no challenge, a place where even love had twisted into a weapon sharp enough to kill.